Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to start talk today. Little material exists pertaining to the modernization of the interwar era, and even less on the National Guard. You can go to the next slide. Most accurate accounts related to the National Guard history are sweeping in scope. The three authors that come to mind are Jim Dan Hill, John Mahan, and Michael Doubler. All touch lightly upon the Guard in the interwar era and tend to avoid the delicate role of peacekeeper during the turbulent strikes of the 1930s. Jerry Cooper's work entitled The Rise of the National Guard and the Evolution of the American Military is excellent, but it stops short of the 1930s. Without going into detail, Cooper merely states that the interwar years were, quote, the golden age for the National Guard, and the interwar years appear serene. In fact, he goes on to say, quote, the interwar years appear serene when compared to the turbulent squabbles between the Guard and the War Department during the 1903-1916 period. Only Robert Daugherty's Weathering the Peace focuses on the interwar years and the role that the Ohio National Guard played in maintaining order during the turbulent decades of labor unrest in that state. Findings uncovered in this research, however, focus on three equally important aspects of the National Guard culture. First, this presentation showcases how the institution favored experiential learning of beyond the classroom instruction. Secondly, it stresses the significance that time restrictions played upon the decision-making process. And finally, it demonstrates the necessity for self-representation, that is having a dedicated bureau chief from the National Guard to represent the institution and advocating for change. The decision to motorize the National Guard's artillery was based on economic and efficient principles that upheld its dual role as a reliable expeditionary and constabulary force. Consequently, this research expands our past perceptions and sees the National Guard as an agent of change. Go ahead and hit the next slide here. Basically, what we're going to cover today is just who is George Leach? The condition of the U.S. military after World War I, the 1920s National Defense Act had upon the force. MacArthur as U.S. Chief of Staff and the Americans' mobilization plan, what the state of the National Guard was in a general sense during the interwar era. And the National Guard's Bureau Chief Leach built the right man for the job in one news article. Then going on from there, the unlikely alliance between George Leach and Ross Collins, who was a congressman, and then roughly covered the strikes of 1934 and the response, and then finish up with the historical ironies and conclusions. Before we go on to the next slide, I just want to say this is a photograph that has been with me since I was a kid. I came, you see it in the magazines or in like American Heritage, and what struck me was all of these people, by the way, became famous in one way or another. Obviously, MacArthur and Pershing. On the far right is Wild Bill Donovan, who leads the OSS. And then the guy reading the orders on the far left is the commanding general of the Rainbow Division, the original Minor, and he becomes head of the Air Service. But the guy in the middle, next to MacArthur, he's never identified, ever. In fact, more recently, I was at an SMH conference and it had that iconic photograph. And it, again, and I just shook my head. I'm like, oh, there he goes again. But his name was George Leach. Next slide. So who is George Leach? Well, he was born in 1876. He was the son of William Leach, who was a participant in the Civil War veteran, served in the 1st Minnesota, became a staff officer, he was not with the 1st Minnesota at Gettysburg, but he was always remained a part of the regiment. And as a young lad, he accompanied his father to dedicate the statue of the 1st Minnesota Regiment at Gettysburg. I want to say it was in 1901. And his general takeaway, you got to meet all these Civil War veterans and was very impressed by their service. George was smart, but did not apply himself to schoolwork. Twice he applied to West Point, and twice he came up as an alternate candidate. He majored in law at the University of Minnesota, and on the side enrolled in military science classes. In a letter to his father, one of the military and science instructors complimented the young aspirant, stating that George Leach showed great aptitude for service and even conspicuous among the large number of the Corps of Cadets for his attention to duty, his physical bearing, and his subordination, end quote. His summers were spent on a farm out west. His aunt Jude had a ranch out there, and so he learned to become a very good horseman. Long hours in the saddle prepared him for the strenuous work that was required in artillery. In 1906, he finally enlists in Battery B of the 1st Minnesota Artillery, and shortly thereafter was elected as the second lieutenant on that. By the way, he's also a huge fan of Teddy Roosevelt, and so you see similarities with that rough and tumble kind of rough in the saddle type of thing. Go to the next slide, please. Leach's entrance into the National Guard came at a time that had emphasized field training and instruction by the regular Army. This was an important element of the 1903 Militia Act. Summer trainings exposed Leach to other aspects of the military, and his experiences were shared at one of the state's annual Guard meetings. These Guard meetings also, it's clear by reading the notes from the meeting minutes that they served as clearinghouse, much like we're having today, on sharing information. Concerning the matter of camp sanitation, Leach had stated about his previous experience the summer before, quote, "I wish I had more time and ability to deal with this part of the camp. For if we had not accomplished another thing, we would be well repaid for this instruction in camp sanitation alone." So he's paying really close attention to the instructions that the regular Army folks are giving in this regard. They also do some minor war game skirmishes, and his closing remarks highlight the importance of artillery in combined arms warfare. Quote, "The necessity of officers of the infantry and cavalry informing themselves in the manner of using artillery in the field, as it is seldom that an artillery officer is over the brigade or corps commander, and in order to direct artillery to the advantage on the field of battle, it is necessary for the commanding officer to have some idea of the limitations and possibilities of artillery." So he's, even as a guardsman, and we don't always think of them as this, but he understands the concept of combined arms warfare. The two photographs, obviously the one on horseback, he loved to demonstrate. The other is the armory. It was called the Kenwood Armory in Minneapolis. It no longer exists, but there's Leach along with part of his regiment there. Armories did remain an important facet of the community and also for the Guard training. But the communities took advantage of the space afforded and expanded their use for community events. In times of peace, they served as venues for equestrian riding or flower shows, or, as I began to find out in the study, motor clubs. And among the emerging motor clubs was the Minneapolis Motor Club that Leach was coincidentally a member of. So motor clubs became a powerful special interest group at the turn of the century, and automobile ownership embodied the status of the upper class, by which they channeled their wealth into political action, lobbying for improved roads, among other safety measures. Improved highways and efficient auto production led to greater affordability and the increased ownership. And by the turn of the century, the automobile ownership national level stood at 23,000 compared to horse ownership, which is still a significant amount, 17 million. In 1916, Leach's regiment was mobilized along with other units across the nation in support of Pershing's punitive expedition. Weather and harsh climate and the lack of sufficient roads hobbled operations. And for the first time in America's military history, the combustion engine appeared, but it was an inauspicious start. Throughout the rank and file, motor vehicles drew particular scrutiny, and experience with motors had a lasting impact upon veterans. There's some remarks or some analysis that crops up in 1930, and they're still referencing things that are happening in 1916 without recognizing or without really taking into consideration the automobile itself had drastically improved since that time. In the aftermath of the Guard mobilization, there was a report entitled "The Report on Mobilization of the Organized Militia National Guard of the United States." It was put out by the National Guard Bureau. The head of the Bureau, still at that time, was a regular Army person. In fact, once they established the Militia Bureau, all officers in charge of the Militia Bureau up until 1920 were regular Army personnel. And the assessment was very critical of the militia. Leach's name comes up, and I've gone through this report 3 or 4 times. His is the only name that's actually mentioned by name, and it's done in a positive light. If they criticize, they'll never criticize an officer, but they'll criticize the unit. So it didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out who might the officers be that were negligent. The other thing, though, that the report neglected was that at the very end of the staging down there along the border was a mock battle that was conducted near Brownsville, Texas, between white and brown forces. Leach's staff officer, Charles Green, noted in his letters home to his family, quote, "The Army did their best that they could, but as they have always been so bound up in red tape, they were timid about taking responsibility and meeting emergencies as they arose, as compared to an ordinary businessman would." In his final analysis, he concluded, quote, "I think that like a great many other instances in the service, the strict adherence to regulations and red tape often destroys to a great extent, and in a majority of cases at least, the dependency of one's own initiative. The National Guard, not being so brought up, are apt to resort to all sorts of clever tricks to gain their point that would not occur to one trained by the book," end quote. Next slide, please. No sooner had the regiment returned to Minnesota than it was reactivated and merged into the 42nd Rainbow Division. And it served overseas when America entered the World War. And it was Douglas MacArthur's bold suggestion to take the disparate militia units that were left over from the Army's reorganization and realignment plan and combine them into one division. Leach actually published a war diary. It was kind of critical of his dad because he would ask his dad, "Well, what about this Civil War?" And his dad never kept a diary or a journal. And so Leach made it a point that when I do this, I will do a war diary. And it was published in like 1924, along that time, 22, I believe it was. And it revealed that unlike many of MacArthur's West Point colleagues, MacArthur treated Leach as an equal. Anybody that's familiar with MacArthur's legacy will remember this, that on the eve of a crucial battle, he was approached by an officer, and it was Leach. And Leach had informed MacArthur that the firing orders that were passed down for the headquarters did not align with the day's prescribed attack plans. Breaking protocol and risking court-martial, MacArthur, with Leach's assistance, rewrote the orders, recognizing that they were risking the lives of others along with their own personal careers. MacArthur nonetheless remarked, quote, "Sometimes it is the order that one disobeys that makes one famous." And that's always in all the MacArthur biographies. Fortunately for all concerned, the plan worked, and MacArthur's reputation for military brilliance and clever lines remained intact. But beyond that clever reply, demonstrated that MacArthur's ability at recognizing talent when he encountered it, whether it was from the ranks of the regulars or guard. Leach had proven his abilities. The thing I found out, and there are numerous criticisms about General MacArthur. One historian said there's either two people, one, those who like MacArthur or those who hate him. And, but for all the criticisms, both Arthur MacArthur, his father, and Douglas MacArthur, none of them reveals hostility or disparaging remarks against the National Guard. Leach's day-to-day jottings in his war diary offer a few moments of insight because of the demands of providing accurate and timely fire support to MacArthur's brigade and other units left him little time for deep reflection. Under Leach's command, the 151st compiled an enviable record. Unlike his contemporaries, Leach's writings omit the derogatory or ethnic slurs so common in wartime literature. He throughout it, he just refers to them as Germans. They're not the Bosch, they're not the Hun. Additionally, he avoids any criticism about national policy or Americans' unpreparedness or President Wilson or pronouncements of the righteousness of the Allied cause. You can probably download War Diary by George Leach and read through it. It's not stupendous. But I am impressed by his just straightforward writing. He doesn't sugarcoat it. And one other thing that appears in that, he is indefatigable. Every day he's around checking, he's constantly out among the different units going, and he's in staff meetings too. But in addition to that, he's constantly out amongst his men. Go ahead to the next slide. Although he was attached to horses, and again, it's evident in War Diary, it's one of the moments that he reveals any emotion. At the end of the war, they turn their horses in, and he expresses deep regret on that. He says, the next day, I don't even feel like I have a full regiment anymore. So he was hit by that. But he also came to recognize a lot of the shortcomings. And here we see a photograph with a horse with a severe case of the mange being treated. But there were other things, disease and sanitary concerns, as well as training and familiarization time between those, not only the horses, but also the men. And again, more and more of them are becoming less and less familiar with the use of horses, especially when you get into 20s and 30s. Other ones include proper pairing of the temperament. You have one cavalry horse, but you have to have a team of horses, and they've got to be able to mesh with one another. Duration, the energy level. Oftentimes, her horses have to rest, and they run out. In fact, the final drive, the regiment is down to like 100 horses, and those they're played out. They're no good. Forage, getting food for them. That's another thing that's difficult. Injury and recuperation, not only of the horses, but also of the rider. And I think there's one more. No, that's the last one. This did not mean that motors were not without problems. Post-war Army assessments also acknowledge that the rapid infusion of roughly 200 makes and models of vehicles made operations difficult. During demobilization, they came up with 4 types to keep and maintain. Standardization was recognized as key to operations. And this meant vehicles with, quote, military characteristics, and it became an ideal, whereas commercial or stock vehicles at the front were considered problematic. Tests in 1919 were conducted, and some of the vehicles, such as the Militor, were favored. However, when the Congressional Budget Act fell, it was eliminated. Furthermore, the Army doctrine placed emphasis on infantry, with all other elements supporting them in action. Go ahead to hit slide 8. So we're going to go back to Leach real quick. He returns home. He becomes mayor of Minneapolis. We'll see that in a moment. But he's also the first Olympic ski coach for the 1924 men's ski team in France. As an aside, I recently met with a family. They still have that sweater. You would not believe how good in condition that is. In 100 years old, and it's phenomenal. There's no moth marks or no stains. It's just immaculate. Go ahead and flip to the next slide. Here we see him escorting Pershing along Victory Memorial Parkway in Minneapolis. That was an area dedicated to the war dead. But he did other things. You saw they became close friends with Helen Keller. Family has a couple photos of her. She came for frequent visits. Tom Mix, Babe Ruth, among others. those were the boutique type of things. But he also was very interested in how the city was run. He looked a lot at the infrastructure and was a big supporter. Here we see him, not here he's slightly off of the picture here, but he's at this event where they're christening a Northwest aircraft. His big things were air, rail, and road, traffic safety. You also see in reports during the day in the newspaper of, quote, retirement of old Dobbin, whether it's the post office or fire department or any other department store delivery. They're starting to ditch the horses and now move to vehicles. The American Red Cross is another example. They use vehicles for outreach and community public. Go ahead and hit one more here. That shows you the growth of the road network. And go ahead and hit one more. This is kind of a busy graph, but it's one of those, it's a book that has 99% of it didn't apply to this research at all. But the one page or 2 pages that did paid off. And it shows, again, all across the board, whether it's jobs related to horses or automobile production, parts, things like that. You see a rise in that. The other thing too, on the slide on the right, you'll see a leveling off of the use of railroads. Mm-hmm. But then if you look on the upper graph above it, you'll see this rapid increase of automobiles. So George Leach wasn't blind to that. He saw it every day, and that slowly becomes part of his mantra. Go ahead and hit to the next slide. This is the important part. I couldn't find any state records on this, but in 1929, Leach, along with the assistance of the state adjutant general Allert Walsh, initiated a motorization program. Now, and it's the only way you find it is in the press reports and in the yearly summary data, or the one that the state adjutant submits. And in the summer of 1930, the Minnesota's 59th Artillery Brigade becomes the first to fully motorize using stock vehicles. Now, some of them, if you see on the far left in the corner, that's actually a mail truck, and it had a real bad habit of breaking down, apparently. But it was a surplus one, and if they could grab it and use it, they did it. 1929, though, was not a good year for Leach. He was passed over for political reasons as the militia bureau chief. He loses $30,000 in the stock market, and he also loses bid for re-election as Minneapolis mayor. The other guy that was put in his place for militia bureau chief happened to be, and we'll hit. I'll wait to get to him. Go ahead to slide 13. So we have a post-war army, and what does that look like? Well, a couple of things. Go ahead and hit the isolation and pacifism has influenced Congress. Next slide. And that it impacts budget restrictions. It curtails the size of the U.S. military. Focus is protecting the U.S. borders and protectorates. Added services, you have the U.S. Chemical Corps and the U.S. Air Corps. So there's more slices of the pie, but the pie hasn't changed. There's also a schizophrenic environment. The NI committee is hell-bent on any type of equipment that's purchased is under suspicion. You're going to get us into another war. And then you've got the arms committee that's saying, why aren't you modernizing? And the Army's kind of caught between that. There's also the physical structure of the War Department. And it's an interesting thing that was remarked by one author that wrote about it. He said that the actual confines prevented large meetings from occurring. So you could never get any really good consensus of it. The whole thing, adhering to the social and political pressure to economize, resulted in further stagnation and unwillingness within the Army to seek creative solutions for any kind of modernization. The result is one aviator later observed, quote, they, meaning the Army, appear to be more concerned with problems that any change might raise than what the opportunities might result from that change. Slide 15. This is also a layout of the post World War I org chart for the U.S. Army, and the star on the far right is obviously the National Guard Bureau. It's actually still called the Militia Bureau. That changes under Leach's leadership. But what's missing from that chart? Well, a couple things. No motorized transport. They had eliminated it after the World War, and they felt that it was best that if each of the individual departments come to their own conclusions of what they needed for motorization. But this creates a siloed environment. And so if they come up with a good idea, another department might cancel it. So it ends up kind of being a mess. Go to the next slide. In 1930, Douglas MacArthur has become the Army Chief of Staff. His stance and actions against the bonus marchers, and by the way, Leach is simpatico with MacArthur on the put down of the marchers. It tarnishes his reputation. More so, he constantly locks horns with a congressman by the name of Ross Collins on the left. Collins is a Mississippi Democrat who chairs the subcommittee on military spending. He's definitely for modernization. He's a big Air Corps, big Billy Mitchell fan. But he also thinks that the officer corps should be drastically downsized. He sees it as a waste. Whereas MacArthur instead places experience over technology. Technology, MacArthur believes, as many of the upper level staff, it's always changing. What's here today is gone tomorrow. And so let's focus on leadership and developing that and have those people ready. It becomes a binary problem. You know, one's pro technology, one's very conservative, and they do not like each other. There's references to Collins and MacArthur's biographies on that. Slide 16. The one aspect that's overlooked is during MacArthur's term as Chief of Staff, is his willingness to scrap the old mobilization plans that were crafted in 1924. He comes into office and the staff like, look at this mobilization plan, and he goes, it sucks, start over. And basically, it's a reduction in force from 6 armies down to 4 that covered 9 regions, with specific mention of support for mobilization from the National Guard. This calls for increased field training on the Guard's part. Now, many support units within the Guard have now become artillery, and training areas are now located further outside the metro area. Again, armories are important, but there's this steady, slow shift, and reliance on vehicles becomes a growing concern. And this is revealed in a lot of the National Guard summary reports that you'll see that they say we have to rely on these old vehicles, and we're not getting replacements, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. Following the U.S. Army's mass demobilization, the Guard is forced to rebuild. Turmoil from the 1920s, the race riots and labor unrest, create the need for a better public safety. Increasingly, the Guard focuses on riot training using non-lethal methods. Additionally, natural disasters, we can all relate to that from the latest news on the media. Floods, fires, earthquakes, all require mobilization of all forces, including artillery units. However, horses are now becoming a burden rather than an asset. And one article on riot control specifically states, leave the horses at home. I show these 2 slides here. The picture on the left is from a commemorative manual, and you see how they're dealing with crowd control on that. If you look on the right, it says between you and what? But what's what? Again, it's not. They're being more, and they're also emphasizing we are the line that stands between peace and tranquility and chaos. And chaos can be anything. It's not just a nasty crowd like that. Go ahead and hit slide 18. 2 years and 60 days after office, Major General William Edmondson, who was selected over Leach, answers a higher calling, literally. He is an ordained minister. He has a doctorate in divinity. And so he says, I have to step down and go to this church that I've been selected to lead. Allert Walsh, again, he's very popular in post-World War II National Guard history, but he's even a kind of a kingmaker back then. He resubmits Leach's name, and in December of 32, Leach takes the oath of office for the bureau chief. And guess who he gets to meet again? His old buddy who he gave support to. Don't tell me that this isn't calculated. Because if you think about it, who better to have as a bureau chief than somebody who MacArthur knows, who he thinks highly of? In his own biography, reminisces his last written piece, MacArthur refers to him as his most able officer. So go to the next slide. Among Leach's archives is a cartoon, and this is a good one. It's a big one. I don't know where it's from, but it was prominent in his scrapbook. It's circa 1918, and if you look at it real closely, it's all about excuse me, having the up-to-date equipment. But this problem that we're going to talk about today doesn't involve armament, it involves transportation, but it's the same problem. They're running into the whole bureaucracy of the War Department. Go ahead, next slide. One thing I was going to say on this is that Leach, when he comes into Washington, I think he's not written, but he's done the motorization at the state level. He's like, well, I'm gonna translate this at the national level. But what does he do? He runs into resistance at the War Department, and there's a kerfluffle that Leach records in his memoirs, that he repeatedly butts up against this phrase, military characteristics about vehicles. And he points outside and he asks his peers, well, what are the military characteristics of the lawnmowers that you use to cut the grass on the parade ground? And the response from those present is they just abruptly say, well, that's for administrative purposes. So his retort was, well, then let me buy stock trucks for administrative purposes. But he gets nowhere. When he comes to Washington, and we're going to track this here, he's told, stay away from Ross Collins. He's the bogeyman. But lo and behold, his first meeting with Ross Collins, they find commonality. By the way, Leach is a Republican. He stays a Republican all his life. He actually supports, but when the bid for MacArthur comes up in 1944, he volunteers to be the chair of the delegation from Minnesota. It's short-lived. Obviously, we know what happens, but he is a conservative Republican. Collins is a Democrat. Any other time, these guys would lock up, but they see one thing in common: motorization, modernization. They're on the same page with that. And so, so he meets with them. And then what happens is that he meets back with MacArthur. It's really interesting how you have to follow the timeline. It gets complicated. But he comes back to MacArthur and tells him about this. But MacArthur says, well, you still have to stay within budget. And so Leach goes back to Collins and the committee and says, well, this would be good. I feel like this would be great for the National Guard, but we should also include the Army on this motorization proviso. Again, I have no documentation on this, but what are the chances because Leach says he's in office daily talking to MacArthur. Gee, what are the chances that MacArthur wants this? So in the spring and summer, he starts to meet with various state adjutant generals to formulate plans to submit this to the National Guard Association. It's the next one. In October, he approaches the National Guard Association in Norfolk, Virginia. And he goes through this very detailed process of this, and he's very adept. And he tells them that Congress has given us the empowerment to make to carve our own future out, and we can do this if we budget wisely. And he compares motorization, Caterpillar tractors, and horses. And of all the three, the stock trucks are the least expensive. And he says to him, go talk amongst yourselves, but know this, that I will be, when I get done with my job as bureau chief, I will come back into the ranks. So whatever decisions that you decide, I will also be a part of that process. So that whole shared thing really tips the scales, and they're all for it. So he comes back to Washington in 1932 and meets with the subcommittee. And again, I don't know how many of you read the subcommittee notes. If you're having trouble sleeping at night, they're good. But there's some interesting stuff that goes on. And you know how they say about how sausage is made, you don't want, this is just a modest motorization proviso. They're only asking for like about $1 million, which he says I could save you if we replace horses and use trucks. I could save that money. I could make up for it in the savings. And so the subcommittee meetings, in short, it's very antagonistic towards MacArthur and other people, like from the Artillery Bureau and all that. Well, Leach comes up, and it becomes a love fest between Collins, and you should read it. Tell us more about motorization. It's really interesting. And so it passed, but then Collins has to go to Congress and introduce it on the House floor. And again, it's further resistance. There's a horse lobby, there's a truck lobby, there's a farm lobby. There's all these lobbyists that are lined up that says, well, if you do this, it's going to cut me out of the public trough. It's going to impact me negatively. But in the end, in fact, he's even accused of, well, this is going to benefit you and your constituency, which in Collins' region, it didn't. He finally comes back and he stands up and he says, quote, "The only man I have conferred with on this matter is General Leach. General Leach is a Republican appointed by a Republican president under Herbert Hoover. And I will say this to his everlasting credit, that he is a gentleman and a high-class soldier. He's trying to administer the National Guard in an economical manner and is actually doing it. Notwithstanding the fact that he is a Republican, I would like to see a Democratic President-elect Roosevelt reappoint him to the position he now holds, because he is the best chief of the militia bureau that I've ever known." So those are high praise. And by the way, when Roosevelt does come, when he's elected to office, he keeps Leach in the position. And eventually the motorization proviso passes, but not without criticism from the conservatives within the Army. Without any official ties to the government, the Army and Navy Journal often serve as a sounding board to openly criticize national policy. Responding to the journal's criticism disparaging the cooperative spirit exhibited between Leach and Collins, the state adjutant of Wisconsin, who was in on the preparatory meetings that we see back in the summer of '32, he quote, "If there is a broad interest in a broad aspect of the national defense in the War Department, it will be found only in the minds of a handful of men." He further adds, "But the vast majority have been regimented and fabricated in an inbred philosophy, always found in the minds reared and cloistered in the college, the monastery, or the fortress. Whenever you want to be sure that you have a man with a worm's eye view of the world, pick him out of a guild, a narrow profession, factory doing piecework, a religious cult, a bureau, chief of guard, a National Guard withstanding, or a standing army that has been standing for a long time. More concise and directed, Oregon's adjutant general facetiously quipped, quote, obscure as the whole thing is, I rather gather the impression from the 2 clippings that you sent to the Army, from the Army and Navy Journal, that they don't like you anymore. Congratulations. Their collective response to these editorials revealed that Leach had upset the highly ordered universe within the military's bureaucratic establishment and exposed its alleged political veneer. Underneath the facade, however, the modest proposal had summarily threatened various special interest groups who believed that adopting stock vehicles either endangered their existing place at the federal trough or denied access altogether. Go ahead and hit next slide, please. It was fortuitous that this motorization plan took effect because while Congress was also enacting bills, they were also enacting bills that were more favorable to the rank and file of the Union. And this all led to more strikes. More strikes became getting out of hand. So this required what? Rapid response. They're not going to get there on horses. They're going to get there on vehicles. Go ahead and hit the next slide. Generally speaking, a delicate dance between liberal politicians and conservatives within the National Guard played out. Democratic governors were often forced to mobilize the National Guard to prevent violence from spreading. Now, prior to the Louisiana maneuvers, the Guard began to train more and more. And go to the next slide here. This is an interesting clip. Oh, yeah, no problem. These field trainings attracted foreign observers, and among them was a lieutenant general who was an attaché for the German army by the name of von Bottger. You can see his name scribbled on there. There is a biography on him, and it was interesting because there's a section on the National Guard that he talks about. And then he said that the military equipment, by and large, for the U.S. military was, quote, of little value. But nevertheless, unlike many of the Army regulars, von Bottger held a very different view of the National Guard, advising his superiors in Berlin that, quote, the worth of the National Guard is important. You will do well not to underestimate it. Having witnessed their professionalism during the San Francisco strikes and their spirited enthusiasm during the training, he counseled, as they are in peace, they will enter war. Go ahead and hit the next slide. Articles slowly started appearing in the Artillery Journal, and as more and more roads became paved, more and more problems persisted amongst shoe horses. These are all different breaks down about the wear and tear on different types of pavement on the horseshoes. And they also started doing more and more experimentation, which the Guard had already started doing too. Go ahead and hit the next slide. I know we're good. But they still had a little bit of animosity. The cartoon in the lower right is really interesting because if you look in the background, you see a horse with his head over the corral there, and it's kind of a nod to the Army. And they have to recognize what does the military do? They often believe in redundancy, and so they're kind of like, do we really want to rush toward modernization? They do, and they start to see the benefits of it. I'll go ahead and hit the next. In his last address to the War College in 1935, Leach uses imagery to convey 3 critical ideas. Referring to the lithograph entitled The Putnam Phalanx, he challenged officers present to discard their utopian stereotypes of the National Guard, arguing that appearances were in fact deceiving. In the transition to motorization, Leach contended that its use had enabled the Guard to maximize training time and focus on the essentials. Chafing against the military's overemphasis on perfection and its obsession with developing the ideal weapon, he argued, quote, we preached that simplicity is a virtue in war. but we deny its value in peacetime, end quote. Um, he maintained that simplicity had resulted in smoother operations and better expected results. As proof, Leach had cited one state's use of motorization, where over 6 days, the National Guard had accumulated a total of 422,000 truck miles, all without significant mishap. Understanding the Guard's culture, its problems and limitations and potentials, Leach asserted was incumbent upon the new generation of leaders sitting in the audience. Now, since its selection as bureau chief of the National Guard, the nation had experienced continued economic hardship and social unrest. Overseas, Japan was at war with China. In South America, Bolivia and Paraguay had battled over territory. In Europe, Italy and Germany had embraced fascism, and the Soviet Union openly advocated for worldwide communist revolution. Despite turbulence and uncertainty at home and abroad, Leach asserted that the National Guard he represented had upheld its role as both a constabulary and ready reserve force. Security was achieved in part due to the motorization. He closes his speech again with imagery. He conjures up an old English sundial with an inscription that reads, "It's later than you think." And he closes his speech by saying, quote, "All the safeguards devised against the coming war of this into this sinful world are crumbling today. Wherever we look, a storm is brewing, and there is one element in war and peace that once expended can never be replaced. That element is time. It is always later than we think. And today it may be very much later. The time to ponder our preparation is now, and the National Guard will play its part." I'll go ahead. We'll close out here. He retires in 1941. He attempts to come back in his mandatory retirement, but he's denied. Go ahead and hit the next slide.
5 days after Pearl Harbor.
Yeah. But he comes back in 1953, and there's historic ironies here. He comes back in 1953 to honor the horses of the regiment that had sacrificed. By the way, it's the last World War I monument that I know of in Minnesota. It was erected in 1953. It was from an existing watering trough that had become dormant after motorization, and it stood vacant. They decided to repurpose it for that. But another irony played out in the Second World War. It did not include the horse. Rather than the thoroughbred, the army mule emerged as the best form of transportation. When word of his death came in 1955, his longtime colleague, friend Allert Walsh had proclaimed, quote, "He was not only the National Guardsman of his time, but of all time." And although Walsh had eclipsed Leach as, quote, "father of the National Guard," Walsh's remarks recognize that the elder's timeless influence is inherent today in the rolling convoys that we see going to and from annual training. Are there any questions out there?
That's outstanding. Now, wasn't it in the, I guess I should phrase it as this way. When was it that young, I think it was a lieutenant, didn't somebody try to take a motor convoy across the US?
Yeah,
yeah. And what was there any connection?
There was. I mentioned the vehicle, the Militor was the name of the vehicle. It was a young, actually lieutenant colonel by the name of Dwight Eisenhower.
Yeah.
What happened was that it was deemed a success. They had learned a lot. They also learned to kind of think on their feet because they were away from Washington, D.C. But budget cuts again. It all came down to money. There was an excellent, like I said, the Militor was an excellent vehicle, and they all raved about it. 4-wheel drive, high clearance, good horsepower, but they were like, nope, it's not in the budget.